Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a close look at one of the darkest, really most heavily concealed chapters in modern history. We're going to examine the horrific realities of the Imperial Japanese Army's covert biological warfare program during the Second World War. Now, I know it's a deeply sobering subject for sure, but understanding exactly how and why these atrocities happened is absolutely crucial if we want to grasp the full scope of wartime history. In 1936, the Japanese Imperial Army established a water purification facility in Manchuria. Inside its walls, there were no survivors.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, a secret medical department.
So on paper, this facility, which was located in the Pingfang district of Harbin, operated under a super bureaucratic, almost entirely mundane front. They called it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Sounds totally harmless, right? Well, actually, its true function under the command of General Shiro Ishii was the research, development, and mass production of lethal biological weapons. And they used absolutely horrific human experimentation to achieve those goals.
And you know, the logic that led to the inception of this program is literally chilling. The 1925 Geneva Protocol explicitly banned the use of biological and chemical weapons in warfare. But instead of acting as a deterrent, Japanese military leaders reasoned that, well, if these weapons were dangerous enough to be banned by the whole international community, that just implied they were incredibly effective. So, to bypass any scrutiny and secure a steady, essentially cost-free supply of human test subjects, they strategically chose to build this massive complex out in occupied Manchuria.
Section 2. The Maruta prisoners.
To carry this out day after day, the perpetrators used a heavily calculated psychological tactic to distance themselves from their own atrocities, profound dehumanization. Because the facility's local cover story was that it was just a lumber mill, the staff routinely referred to the human prisoners as Maruta, which translates to logs. They'd even ask each other things like, "How many logs fell today?" It was this sick inside joke that allowed the researchers to entirely strip the victims of their humanity.
But we really have to counter that dehumanization right now by looking at the reality of who these victims were. These were not logs. These were human beings. The victims included Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, Russian and Korean prisoners, political dissidents, and just tragically pregnant women, children, and infants. We're talking about at least 3,000 men, women, and children systematically murdered inside the Pingfang camp alone, and thousands more across the various branch facilities.
Section 3. Gruesome human experimentation. I have to warn you, the facts ahead are incredibly grim, but they're essential to understanding the reality of Unit 731. The sheer variety of horrors inflicted on the prisoners is just staggering. And remember, these weren't isolated incidents. These tests were systematically carried out as standard operating procedure. We're talking about prisoners forced to endure vivisections without anesthesia, having limbs deliberately frozen and then struck to test frostbite treatments, and being subjected to lethal exposure to chemical weapons, shrapnels, and devastating diseases like syphilis, plague, and anthrax.
The brutal reality of how researchers actually obtained fresh biological specimens for analysis was documented by American historian Sheldon H. Harris. He wrote, "If Ishii or one of his co-workers wished to do research on the human brain, then they would order the guards to find them a useful sample. A prisoner would be taken from his cell. A guard would smash the victim's head open with an axe. His brain would be extracted, off to the pathologist."
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute chilling desensitization of the staff. What I'm about to read is a first-hand account from a former medical assistant who was speaking anonymously to the New York Times about his very first time vivisecting a live, plague-infected human being. He said, "I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me because it was my first time."
Section 4. Biological Warfare Unleashed.
Now, the horrors of Unit 731 were not just contained to the laboratories. General Ishii determined early on that fleas were highly efficient carriers for the bubonic plague. So, to weaponize this, Unit 731 maintained around 4,500 flea incubators. Working together, these things were capable of producing a staggering 45 kilograms of plague-infected fleas per breeding cycle. That is a massive scale of biological weaponry.
Between 1940 and 1943, these biological weapons were practically deployed against Chinese cities like Ningbo and Chengde, and the deployment methods were devastatingly simple but effective.
Low-flying airplanes would literally drop biodegradable bombs packed with infected fleas. Ground troops would go in and infuse typhoid and cholera pathogens directly into town wells and marshes. And researchers would even distribute poisoned food and candy to unsuspecting local civilians.
The resulting outbreaks of plague, cholera, and anthrax completely devastated the region. It is clearly documented that over 200,000 Chinese civilians were killed as a direct result of these deliberate biological attacks. Just an unbelievable loss of life.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 5, Surrender, Immunity, and Cover-Up. Tracing the rapid sequence of events at the end of the war reveals a really divergent path of international justice. In August 1945, as the Soviet Army approached, Unit 731 hastily destroyed the facility and murdered every single remaining prisoner just to hide the evidence. Shortly after that, between 1945 and 1947, the United States secretly negotiated an immunity deal with the perpetrators. Meanwhile, right around the same time in December 1949, the Soviet Union held their own war crimes trials in Khabarovsk.
The explicit nature of the American cover-up is completely laid bare in a 1947 communication from General Douglas MacArthur to Washington. Basically, the U.S. made a calculated decision. They prioritized securing exclusive access to the biological warfare data over prosecuting mass murder. They figured, well, if they didn't grant immunity, all that exclusive data would fall straight into the hands of the Soviet Union.
So, objectively comparing the geopolitical approaches, we see two entirely different responses. The U.S. concealed the data and allowed key figures, including General Ishii himself, to go entirely free without facing any trial whatsoever. Conversely, the Soviet Union prosecuted 12 military leaders and scientists, sentencing them to labor camps. The United States, remaining committed to its cover-up, actively dismissed the Soviet trials, publicly branding them as mere communist propaganda.
But perhaps the most tragic futility of this entire immunity deal lies in the eventual scientific consensus. Because the data they gained at the cost of tens of thousands of tortured lives, it was ultimately considered by American scientists to be of pretty minor importance. They eventually concluded that the Japanese research was crude, ineffective, and completely lacked the rigorous scientific foundations needed to be of any real value.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and it leaves us with a provocative final question. When the architects of atrocities are granted immunity in the name of science, what is the true cost of that knowledge? It really forces us to ponder the exceptionally dark intersection of medical ethics, geopolitics, and historical memory. Thank you so much for joining me to uncover the facts of Unit 731. Keep seeking the truth, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.